Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into what is, well, really a regulatory revolution happening in the European Union, specifically in agriculture. The promise is enormous. We're talking about next-generation crops, ones that are climate resilient, give higher yields, and drastically cut the need for chemicals. Pesticides, fertilizers, all of that.
It really does sound like the perfect scenario, doesn't it? For food security, for climate change mitigation.
Yeah.
But getting there means threading this incredibly complicated needle of EU regulation. And what's fascinating here is that after years and years of debate, they finally reached a major provisional political agreement on these new genomic techniques, NGTs.
Exactly. And this is a massive moment. This agreement is a genuine, a seismic shift away from the old, highly stringent legislation. The legislation that's, for a quarter century, basically kept GMOs out of the European food supply.
Right.
The whole goal, as the Parliament and the Council defined it, is to make the EU food system more secure, more sustainable, and to do that by embracing tech that gives us more resilient plants.
And that's our mission for this deep dive.
Right.
You shared the source material, the details of this deal, and we need to cut through the complexity. We need to understand how the EU is trying to bring in, Nobel Prize-winning technology while somehow holding on to its famous environmental safeguards. That must have required some incredible political compromise.
Oh, absolutely. When you talk about compromise, you have to remember the history here. Europe has always been the home of the precautionary principle. The idea that if you can't prove something is perfectly safe, you just don't use it.
You just don't use it. Exactly. So moving away from that kind of blanket condemnation of all genetic modification, that required the Parliament, which is often more environmentalist,
Right.
to agree with the Council, which often represents member states who are, worried about agricultural competitiveness. And the essential insight for you, the listener, is that the entire future of this tech in Europe now hinges on one single fundamental distinction. They didn't just loosen the rules, they created a whole new two-tier regulatory framework. And it's all based on how the genetic alteration was done.
That sets the stage perfectly.
Right.
So let's jump right into that. Section 1, NGT1 versus NGT2.
Yeah.
This split is, it's the crucial starting point for understanding everything else in this deal.
Okay, so broadly speaking, NGTs are just advanced techniques that let scientists alter the genetic material of an organism with incredible precision.
Right.
Unlike the older methods, the traditional GMOs, which often involved sort of randomly inserting foreign DNA, NGTs like CRISPR, they allow for these tiny targeted edits inside the organism's own DNA.
And that distinction, precision versus randomness, that's what's driving the whole new regulatory approach.
It is. The co-legislators agreed to split the plants into two categories. It's a way to separate the really targeted, what they see as low-risk edits, from the more complex, totally novel alterations.
And this is really the core of the whole agreement.
It is. It starts with NGT1. And these are defined as plants that, and this phrasing is absolutely vital, could also occur naturally or through conventional breeding.
That phrase is the regulatory key, isn't it? Because if NGT1 just mimics changes that might happen in a field over, a very long time through natural mutation or traditional trunk pollination.
The kind of thing farmers have been doing for centuries.
Right. Then they're considered lower risk.
And the regulatory consequence of that is, well, it's monumental. NGT1 plants will be exempt from most of the precautionary requirements of the old EU NGMO legislation.
So that means they get to skip that long, incredibly expensive risk assessment process that, it took years and really stifled innovation.
It's the innovation fast track, as long as you stay within those parameters of natural occurrence.
So, okay, let me see if I've got this. If I'm a breeder and I use an NGT to edit one single base pair in a rice plant to make it drought resistant, and that specific edit is something that could have happened naturally over a few decades,
then you qualify. You get NGT1 status and the lighter regulatory touch.
But that raises a huge question, doesn't it? How do regulators actually check this? How do they determine what counts as natural occurrence? It can't just be a feeling.
No, it's not subjective at all. The Commission has to establish very strict technical parameters. They'll look at the size of the modification, how many edits were made, and whether those specific edits could, credibly be achieved by conventional methods like mutagenesis or simple breeding.
So this is where the details really matter. It's not just a philosophical idea. There has to be a detailed framework to make sure only very, very targeted modifications get that exemption.
Exactly. And that brings us to NGT2, which is basically the catch-all category. It's defined as all other NGT plants.
Simple as that.
Simple as that. If the modification involves introducing foreign genes, or if it creates traits that can never happen naturally, or if it just crosses that technical threshold for complexity, it falls into this higher risk group.
And NGT2 then stays under the full umbrella of that precautionary principle.
Precisely. NGT2 plants will still be subject to the full, rigorous rules of the existing GMO legislation. That means stringent, case-by-case risk assessments, full traceability, labeling, and a much, much longer authorization process.
So the EU is basically saying, for these complex, non-natural changes, we are not backing down from our historical concern over unforeseen effects.
Yes. If we think about the strategic rationale, it's a very careful balancing act. They're trying to fast-track the innovation that seems less risky, the nature-mimicking edits, while keeping this really tight control over the major genetic alterations.
You had a great analogy for this earlier, which I think really helps ground it for everyone listening.
Oh, right. Think of NGT1 like a surgeon making one super precise stitch to fix a small tear in a piece of fabric. The result is something you could have achieved with very careful conventional tailoring.
Okay.
NGT2, on the other hand, is like replacing the fabric's entire fiber structure with some new synthetic material that has never existed in nature before.
It's completely novel. The risk of an unforeseen reaction is higher, so the need for intense scrutiny, for safety checks, that remains absolute.
And just to wrap up this section, it's important to note that these rules are global. The two-tier standard applies to plants from the EU and to imported plants.
So if a drought-resistant wheat developed in the U.S. wants to get into the European market,
it has to be classified first. Is it NGT1 or NGT2? And if it's NGT2, it faces all those old-school GMO hurdles.
That's a powerful standard to set for the rest of the world. But okay, now we have the definitions. The real breakthrough, the political masterstroke here, is in how the EU is channeling the application of the technology. So moving into Section 2, we have to talk about the crucial safeguards they built into the NGT1 category. Because being exempt doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. It means the EU is strictly dictating how NGTs can be used.
These safeguards are the reason the Parliament's environmental groups finally agreed to the deal. It was a successful push to make sure NGTs serve the green transition and sustainability, rather than just becoming another tool for big agricultural corporations.
So let's talk about the criteria for NGT1 beyond just the technical stuff. The Parliament specifically demanded, and they got, an exclusionary list. A list of intended traits that are absolutely not allowed in NGT1 plants.
And if a trait is on this list, the plant automatically gets bumped up to NGT2 and faces the full regulatory burden. These are the red lines.
And the two forbidden traits are incredibly revealing. You cannot use NGT1 to develop plants with known insecticidal effects or, and this is the big one, tolerance to herbicides.
Let's pause on that herbicide tolerance part because that is where so much of the political and historical context is. This is the surprise factor. If NGT1 is supposed to fast-track innovation, why would you explicitly ban the traits that are most desirable to the massive chemical companies?
This seems counterintuitive, right?
It does, but it's because the EU is trying to stop history from repeating itself. The first generation of GMOs, think of things like Roundup-ready crops. They weren't just designed to increase yield on their own. They were designed to tolerate specific herbicides, which allowed farmers to just spray huge amounts of chemicals to kill all the weeds without killing their crop.
Which, ironically, just led to more chemical use and then the development of superweeds that were resistant to those chemicals.
Yeah.
The whole system just became more and more reliant on chemical inputs.
Exactly. So by forbidding herbicide tolerance in NGT1, the EU is making a very clear statement. They're saying, we are not going to fast-track innovation that ties our farmers even more tightly to the chemical industry.
That is a really clever regulatory pivot. They're not banning the technology. They're channeling its application. By banning the development of chemical tolerance via NGT1, they're forcing R&D to focus on intrinsic plant resilience.
Right. If you can't make the plant tolerant to the chemical, you have to focus your NGT research on making the plant resistant to the pest or the drought itself. It steers the use of NGTs directly towards sustainability, towards plants that resist drought, fight off fungus, and just inherently need fewer fertilizers and pesticides while still giving you a high yield.
It effectively marries the technological power of NGTs with the EU's big environmental goals.
Yeah.
It's like they're saying, if you want the NGT1 fast track, you have to contribute to the green transition.
And to make sure that happens, the regulation doesn't stop there. The Commission and member states have a very specific ongoing task. They have to actively monitor the sustainability impacts of NGT plants.
How does that work in practice? That sounds like a massive job.
It is, but it's crucial for accountability. They'll use data from existing official controls. So they'll be collecting information on input use pesticide and fertilizer consumption on farms growing NGT crops. They'll also be looking at biodiversity metrics.
So it's not a one-time approval. It's an ongoing promise to verify that the technology is actually reducing environmental harm and strengthening food security over time.
It gives them a mechanism to make sure the technology is fulfilling its green transition promise and not just, creating unforeseen problems or just becoming business as usual chemical farming. This monitoring is the operational heart of the whole sustainability promise.
This push for sustainable, high-value traits then leads us to the next really complex question. If researchers develop this groundbreaking, drought-resistant wheat, who owns it? This is where the legal and economic interests collide. Section 3, intellectual property, patents, and fair access.
Well, innovation costs a lot of money, billions often, in research and development. So investors need protection, and that protection comes from patents. The deal allows patents for NGTs, which is vital. Without that guarantee of IP protection, large companies just won't fund the research.
That's the core economic reality, sure. But the source material also highlights the other side of that coin, the farmer. The EU has a long history of protecting small farmers and breeders, and genetic tech often threatens the traditional right of farmers to, save and replant their own seeds.
And that tension is resolved with a few crucial safeguards that the members of European Parliament managed to get in there. First, there's an immediate exception. Patents are not allowed for traits or sequences that already exist in nature or are produced by traditional breeding.
That's a big one. It stops corporations from patenting fundamental biology that should really be in the public domain.
It's a huge victory for smaller breeders. But the real battle is about preventing market concentration, ensuring affordability, and protecting that historical right for farmers to save and replant seeds from their own harvest without getting sued.
Right.
And this is where the EU is trying to get ahead of the problem. They're building in mechanisms to mediate these conflicts before they explode. The main tool for this is the creation of an EU Code of Conduct on patents.
A code of conduct. What's the timeline on that, and why is it so important?
It's incredibly important because current IP law just wasn't designed for the precision of NGTs. The Commission has to draw up this code within 18 months of the regulation entering into force, which, that 18-month deadline tells you they see this as extremely pressing.
So what is this code of conduct supposed to do for a small farmer, specifically?
It tackles two critical issues. First, it has to set up rules for licensing patents under fair and reasonable conditions. Let's break that down. It means if a small breeder wants to use a patented NG2 trait to improve a local seed variety, the patent holder can't just charge a ridiculous price or impose unfair terms to block them out.
So it's a proactive measure against monopolies. It makes sure the tech is affordable and accessible, not just locked up by the biggest players.
Exactly. And the second purpose deals with a massive headache in modern farming: accidental infringement. The code must establish methods for the amicable settlement of patent disputes, especially in the case of unintentional minor presence of patented material in a farmer's fields.
That phrase, unintentional minor presence, seems really important. Can you give us a concrete example of why that's so protective?
Sure. Imagine a small farmer saving seeds from their own heritage field, and the big farm next door is growing a patented NGT1 crop. Due to wind or bees, a tiny, undetectable amount of that patented pollen drifts over.
Okay.
Later, when the small farmer tests their seeds, they might find a trace of the patented material. Without this code, that farmer could be facing an immediate, very expensive lawsuit for patent infringement just for saving their own seeds.
That would be terrifying for a small operator. So amicable settlement is basically a legal shield. It provides a way to resolve the issue without going to court when the contamination is minor and accidental, and it stops the farmer from being financially ruined by something they couldn't even control.
Yes, it prevents the immediate use of those aggressive legal tactics you sometimes see. It's the EU recognizing the reality of farming and building in protections for smallholders.
But what if the code of conduct doesn't work? I mean, it relies on cooperation. What if the licensing terms are still too high?
Well, the EU wisely built in an ultimate backstop. The agreement says that if a Commission impact assessment shows there are still significant barriers to accessing patented NGTs, meaning the code isn't working, then the Commission must take action.
And what kind of action are we talking about?
Real regulation. The action could involve further legislative measures to set up mandatory conditions if needed. This is the EU saying, we'll try self-regulation first, but if the market creates monopolies that threaten our food security or farmers' rights, we reserve the right to impose legally binding terms on patent holders.
That is a powerful check. It ensures this technology, which they see as a public good, can't just be locked away for private profit.
It's the political glue holding the whole IP section together. It protects innovation while trying to make sure the benefits are shared across the whole agricultural community.
Okay, so we've got the regulatory split, the sustainability demands, and the legal framework for IP. That brings us to Section 4. Traceability, the organic sector, and the global reality of this tech. How will people actually know what you're dealing with?
Transparency is absolutely key, especially with Europe's history of consumer skepticism about genetic modification. So the EU wants to build trust by providing clarity, even for the fast-tracked NGT1s.
So for NGT1 plants, the ones that are mostly exempt from the old rules, there are still tracking requirements.
Yes. They have to be clearly indicated in all official national and EU databases. And this is key for the farmer. Seed bags for NGT1 plants must be explicitly labeled NGT1.
Okay, so this isn't a consumer label on the final food product. It's for the farmer, so they can make an informed choice.
Exactly. It's for professional transparency and for database tracking. Meanwhile, for NGT2s, the high-risk ones, full traceability and full consumer labeling remain mandatory.
And just like the old GMO rules, member states still have a lot of power over NGT2.
They do. The source material confirms countries can still restrict or prohibit the cultivation of NGT2s even after they're authorized at the EU level.
That opt-out clause for NGT2 is crucial, isn't it? It reflects how politically sensitive this is. It lets individual nations cater to their own agricultural policies or consumer anxieties.
It provides that political flexibility. It means the EU can move forward on authorizations, while a country that has, say, strong cultural opposition can still maintain a national ban on planting.
Now let's talk about a major group that has long been skeptical of all of this, the organic sector. How does this new law handle the relationship between cutting-edge genomics and the strict principles of organic farming?
The position is very clear. NGTs will not be allowed in organic production. The organic standards will remain strict and will exclude any techniques involving genetic modification, whether they mimic nature or not.
That maintains the integrity of the organic label, which is essential for consumer confidence. But, as you said earlier, reality is messy.
It is. And this is where technical necessity comes in, especially with NGT1. Because NGT1 is defined as mimicking nature, the co-legislators agreed that the technically unavoidable presence of NGT1 plants would not count as non-compliance for an organic operator.
So, if an organic farmer does everything right, but a tiny bit of NGT1 pollen drifts into their field from miles away, they won't lose their certification.
Precisely. It's a pragmatic recognition that zero presence is basically impossible in an open environment. Without that exception, you'd effectively be banning organic farming anywhere near NGT1 cultivation, which would be devastating.
And the Commission also has to look at the bigger picture, right? The broader impact on the organic sector.
Yes. They're tasked with assessing whether this regulation creates any administrative or economic burdens for organic operators. And that includes looking at potential negative impacts on consumer perception.
That's a critical point. Even if the presence is legally permitted, if consumers start seeing headlines about genetic material in organic products, they could do massive damage to the organic market's reputation.
It's a perception problem, absolutely. The EU has to monitor whether the presence of NGTs in the food supply negatively impacts consumer confidence in the organic label.
Okay, finally, let's bring this back to the global marketplace. While the EU has been debating NGT1 and NGT2 for years, the rest of the world has been moving fast.
We have to look outward to see the reality here. Several NGT products are already on the market outside the EU. It shows that while Europe has been carefully crafting its rules, the science has advanced to the point of commercialization elsewhere.
And the source material gives some real-world examples that show the kinds of benefits the EU is hoping to unlock with this.
Yeah, we're talking about things like corn, wheat, and rice varieties that need significantly less water. That's direct climate resilience. Imagine the impact of truly drought-resistant staple crops.
And even everyday things like bananas and mushrooms that have been edited so they don't brown as quickly. That directly reduces food waste.
These examples really highlight the tangible benefits the EU has been missing out on. The agreement is trying to close that gap by fast-tracking similar products under the NGT1 label.
The rapporteur, Jessica Pulfjord, she called this a historic day. She said it's a breakthrough that boosts not only our farmers' competitiveness, but also Europe's position in research and innovation. It's being framed as a huge step forward.
It certainly is. It moves the EU from a position of, well, near total stagnation on genetic engineering to one that's trying to be more nuanced, more risk-based, and to channel the technology toward public good.
So let's do a quick summary for you, the listener, to bring all these points together.
First, the foundation is the two-tier split. NGT1 is for plants that mimic nature, they get the fast track. NGT2 is for everything else, and it stays under the full, strict GMO rules.
Second, that NGT1 access isn't a free pass. It comes with a mandatory sustainability focus through an exclusionary list, specifically banning traits like herbicide tolerance to force R&D toward resilience.
Third, patents are allowed, but there are crucial safeguards for farmers. The right to save seeds, and an EU code of conduct to mediate legal fights over licensing fees and accidental contamination. And all of that is backed by the threat of mandatory regulation if it fails.
And finally, NGTs are banned from organic farming. But, crucially, the technically unavoidable presence of NGT1 is allowed, and the whole framework has to be monitored so it doesn't harm the organic sector's reputation.
Which brings us to the final and I think really important question as we look forward. This deal is provisional. Once it's formally endorsed and published, it enters into force 20 days later. But, and this is big but it, the actual application of the rules across member states will only begin 2 years later.
2 years. That is an eternity in biotech innovation. The pace of change is just accelerating.
Exactly. We already know NGT products like non-browning bananas and drought-resistant wheat are being sold outside the EU.
Yeah.
So what happens in the next 2 years as these technologies advance globally? And how will the EU's new, very specific NGT1 label be understood and accepted by its international trading partners?
Will the EU's strict NGT1 parameters become a kind of gold standard for sustainable genomics around the world? Or will that unique, complex designation just become a barrier when trading with countries like the US or Brazil or China, who might prefer a simpler approach?
That is the real challenge. The EU has solved its internal regulatory battle, for now. But the next 2 years will define its place in the global food technology race. It's a race against time and a race for international acceptance.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take those monumental intellectual ideas, the theories that genuinely define decades of policy and thought, and we drill down to figure out not just what they said, but what the consequences of those ideas were. Okay, let's unpack this. We are traveling back to a really pivotal moment in global history. The high watermark of post-Cold War optimism, the early 1990s. The Soviet Union was gone. The Berlin Wall was basically just rebel for tourists.
Right.
And it really felt like the world was heading toward one single political destination. And it's into this atmosphere of just immense confidence that Francis Fukuyama publishes a book making this audacious, almost terrifying claim that humanity had reached the end of history.
And that phrase, the end of history, is probably one of the most misunderstood political ideas of the last 50 years.
Absolutely.
It just suggests this boring, settled world, but the intellectual heft behind it is anything but. So our mission today, as we dive deep into the source material, Fukuyama's original 92 text, his updates, the critiques, is to fully dissect it.
Yeah, we need to get it right.
We need to grasp its philosophical roots, the evidence that made it feel so true in the 90s, and maybe, most importantly, the 3 big waves of challenges: cultural, geopolitical, and structural, that have tried to bury the thesis ever since.
This book is it's foundational. I mean, to understand the foreign policy of the Clinton years, the Bush years, globalization, even the current conflicts with China and Russia, you just have to understand the framework Fukuyama built.
He really did. He handed the victorious West a coherent story for the future.
But as we're about to see, history had a lot more fighting left to do. We're aiming for a deep, really exhaustive exploration here, giving enough time to all the nuanced arguments this concept brings up.
So we have to begin with the definition, right? Because the biggest mistake people make is assuming the title means, events just stop happening.
Right, that the news cycle ends.
Exactly. Fukuyama's core argument, first in his 89 essay and then the full book, was that the end of the Soviet Union confirmed the victory of Western liberal democracy. This meant humanity had reached the final stable stage of its political evolution.
He defined it as, and I'm quoting here, the endpoint of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. But what gave him that kind of confidence? I mean, it can't just be the Berlin Wall falling. That's just an event. Where's the philosophical muscle for this?
Well, for that, you have to look back to Germany, specifically to the intellectual lineage of G.W.F. Hegel and his interpreters.
Okay.
Both Hegel and later Karl Marx saw history not as just a random series of events, but as a linear, progressive, sometimes violent, but ultimately rational process.
Yeah.
It was driven by ideological conflict.
So for Marx, that process ends with communism.
Precisely. But Fukuyama follows the Hegelian path. For Hegel, history was driven by a dialectic, a struggle for recognition. Fukuyama calls it thymos, which is this innate human desire to be seen as having dignity.
So he's not just talking about winning a war. He's talking about winning the argument over the very structure of reality.
That's exactly. And liberal democracy, with its ideas of universal rights and voting, is the political system that finally satisfies that universal desire for dignity. It makes it the final rational destination. Fukuyama, who was heavily influenced by the Hegelian scholar Alexander Kojev, basically concluded that liberal democracy plus a market economy is just a fundamentally better system ethically, politically, economically than anything else.
So the evolution is complete?
The evolution is complete. There is nothing intellectually beyond it.
Okay, so let's nail that crucial clarification then. If the ideological struggle is over, what does that mean for, wars and revolutions? Because clearly those things still happen.
And that is the crucial clarification. History, with the capital H, the big struggle between ideologies has ended. History, with the lowercase h, the day-to-day news, absolutely continues. He is emphatically not saying events will stop. His point is that all future events, even if they include, say, a temporary dictatorship or a messy regional war, will ultimately just reinforce the liberal democratic framework in the long term.
Because the alternatives have all failed.
They're historical dead ends. Theocracy, fascism, communism, they've all proven they can't deliver long-term stability and prosperity.
So that makes the system a kind of political attractor, doesn't it? All other forms are just unstable and eventually decay toward that liberal democratic model.
That's a theory, yes. And we also have to dispel another really common misconception, that he was advocating for a strictly American-style democracy.
Right. Critics always frame it as this sort of American victory lap. But the source material is much more nuanced.
Much more. Fukuyama and his defenders have consistently said his argument was only for the basic framework. Parliamentary democracy, individual rights, a market economy. He wasn't saying everyone should become a cultural clone of the U.S.
In fact, he gave a specific, and I thought, really fascinating counterexample.
He did.
He cited the European Union as a more accurate reflection of the post-historical world than the United States. Now, that seems really counterintuitive, doesn't it? The U.S. was the superpower championing the idea. So why the EU?
Well, it goes back to that Hegelian idea of transcending the need for violence. The whole project of the European Union is an attempt to move past the traditional organizing principle of history, which is, national sovereignty and raw power.
Okay.
By creating this transnational rule of law, the EU has basically forced its members to settle arguments with negotiation and bureaucracy, not with armies. And that, for Fukuyama, is the real sign of a post-historical condition.
He's looking at a system that actively tries to make war between its members literally unthinkable.
Exactly. And he contrasted this with the U.S., which still focused on the traditional stuff,
Yeah.
belief in God, fierce protection of national sovereignty, and using military strength. The U.S. still acted like a historical great power.
While the EU was trying to subordinate power to law.
Right. So the triumph wasn't American exceptionalism. It was the triumph of a specific set of secular, market-based, rule of law institutions.
That really shifts the focus from a victory for one country to a victory for a set of ideas.
Okay, so now that we've set up the theory, we need to anchor it to what was actually happening in the early 1990s. What was the empirical evidence that was so compelling?
Well, the intellectual cornerstone has to be the democratic peace theory. I mean, if the main driver of history is great power conflict, and mature democracies just don't go to war with each other, then the spread of democracy logically leads to the end of major wars.
It's an incredibly powerful idea. If you accept that premise, then peace isn't just a hope, it's a structural inevitability once democracy wins. But, and we have to stress this, the theory is, well, it's complicated. It's constantly attacked because its validity really depends on how you define war and how you define mature democracy.
Tell us a bit more about that. I mean, why is a simple concept so hard to pin down?
Well, critics will point out that lots of emerging democracies have been in conflicts, but then you get into arguments over whether it was a full-blown war or, an intervention or a covert operation.
The definitions.
Exactly. And how mature does a democracy have to be? 5 years? 50? This complexity keeps it from being an ironclad law, but it was a very strong theoretical foundation for the optimism of the time.
But it wasn't just theory. It was backed up by massive, observable global shifts that were happening right then. This wasn't just philosophy. It was describing something real.
Yes, absolutely. The most concrete evidence was the change you saw in regions that used to be military hotspots. Look at South America. For most of the 20th century, you had border disputes, military juntas, intense rivalries.
Argentina and Brazil, for example.
Perfect example. As those nations moved toward liberal democracy, interstate warfare in the region it basically vanished. And you saw the same pattern in parts of Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe after the Soviets collapsed.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the sheer scale of the data showing this peace dividend in the 90s was it was profoundly compelling. If you were living through it, what are the specific stats that fueled this belief?
Well, studies from right after the Cold War showed this sudden, unmistakable drop across multiple categories of conflict. I mean, we're talking about a huge statistical decline in total warfare globally.
Wow.
Interstate wars, the classic conflicts between nations, they just plummeted. Even internal conflicts like ethnic wars and revolutionary wars saw a temporary but really significant decrease.
And what about the human cost?
Well, maybe the most telling thing from a humanitarian view was the number of refugees and displaced persons. That number saw a huge reduction in the decade right after the Cold War.
So if the 20th century was defined by these massive ideological wars, communism versus fascism versus imperialism, and then suddenly those great ideological engines just shut down.
Then the resulting peace looks like confirmation that the evolutionary battle was over.
It created this atmosphere of, looking back now, almost euphoric confidence. The conclusion that history, with a capital H, had ended seemed totally justifiable based on the facts on the ground at that moment.
It really wasn't just wishful thinking, it was data-driven optimism.
But if the data was so strong, why didn't Fukuyama spend more time building a defense for the inevitable exceptions? I mean, was the optimism just so blinding that it overlooked potential problems?
That's a really sharp point. I think the critique is that the post-91 moment created a huge confirmation bias. The Soviet collapse felt so final, so total, that it was hard to imagine another force powerful enough to restart that ideological struggle.
He was focused on the long-term trend.
He was. And so things like regional ethnic conflicts were seen as, minor historical bumps in the road, things that would eventually be smoothed out by this dominant trend. The challenge, as critics would soon point out, was that those minor bumps were much more fundamental than the thesis allowed for.
Which brings us right to the first major wave of pushback. The argument that culture and identity are actually far more powerful drivers of human conflict than any simple political system.
This is the big shift from ideology to civilization. Critics argued that Fukuyama mistakenly assumed that the victory of secular liberal institutions would just erase these deep-seated cultural, religious, and ethnic loyalties.
But they don't go away.
They don't. And the argument was that these identities would become the new primary fault lines of global conflict.
And the most famous response, the direct intellectual counterpunch, was Samuel P. Huntington's 1993 essay, which became the 1996 book, The Clash of Civilizations.
Huntington completely reframed the debate. He said that the 20th century fight between political ideologies was just being replaced by the ancient foundational conflicts between civilizations.
And he defined those by shared history, religion, customs.
Exactly. And crucially, he said that the dominant civilization in a region would decide the form of government, and that form would not necessarily be liberal democracy.
He specifically called out the perceived inability of Western political ideas to take root in certain places, and he infamously singled out Islam.
He did. Huntington argued that Islam had characteristics that made it intrinsically resistant to secular liberalism, and he famously described its borders as bloody. His point was that the deep identity from religion was a far more powerful driver of conflict than abstract ideas about parliaments.
And we also saw Benjamin Barber framing a similar conflict, but using more economic terms, with his work, jihad versus McWorld.
Yeah, Barber was looking at globalization itself. He saw this dual competition. On one side, you have McWorld, which is the relentless push toward a secular, homogenous, corporate-friendly, consumerist world.
Kind of a cultural liberalization.
Right. And competing with that was jihad, which he defined broadly as the forces of tribalism, religious fundamentalism, and local identity that were pushing back against that homogenization. And he argued that neither of those forces really supported stable democracy.
The ultimate violent proof for so many people that the end of history was just a vacation came with the September 11th attacks.
The attacks were just a catastrophic shock to that 1990s consensus. People immediately declared the thesis dead. Fareed Zakaria called it the end of history, which perfectly captured that sudden realization that this kind of ideological conflict was not only possible, but had been unleashed by a force that didn't fit the old Cold War boxes.
So Fukuyama had to defend his thesis, which looked like it had been completely dismantled. How did his original take on radical Islam hold up, and what was his response?
Well, in the original 92 book, he addresses Islam pretty dismissively. He argued that radical Islam wasn't a system that could be exported globally. You know, it wasn't an imperialist force like Stalinism.
Okay.
He believed that states governed by those principles, like Iran or Saudi Arabia, were fundamentally brittle and unstable. His prediction was that they couldn't deliver the economic prosperity and political stability needed to survive. He thought they'd either have to democratize, like Turkey, or just disintegrate.
A prediction that was immediately challenged after 9/11. What was his defense when the criticism was at its peak?
In October 2001, he doubled down. He said, "I believe that in the end, I remain right." He refined the definition, saying the thesis only referred to the ultimate political system being settled. He clarified that it does not imply a world free from conflict. Conflict would remain, but the formal political system, democracy, and markets was still the unchallenged winner.
But this brings us to a huge nuance that his critics, especially non-Western scholars, focused on. This claim that Islamic forms of governance are inherently unstable. The source material presents a strong counter-argument to that.
And this is a critical point we have to stress. The argument is that Fukuyama really underestimated the resilience and adaptability of diverse Islamic political thought. Critics say that the instability in many Muslim-majority nations is often way more complex.
Right.
It's frequently tied to colonial legacies, Cold War proxy fights, or economic pressures, external factors, not inherent religious flaws.
So the stability of certain states directly contradicts his prediction of inevitable decay. Which countries are the case studies that challenge that?
Well, you can look at countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. They have huge, diverse Muslim populations, and they've shown long-term economic growth and political stability without conforming entirely to that secular Western model. Or you could look at the Gulf states like Qatar and the UAE. They've achieved immense economic stability under non-democratic Islamic-informed models. These cases really challenge the idea that such systems have to either democratize or fail.
And beyond just stability, there's the intellectual argument that Islamic political thought offers its own robust alternative models for governance.
Absolutely. Critics point to concepts rooted in Islamic thought that offer powerful frameworks for stable governance that just bypass the liberal democratic structure.
Yeah.
For instance, the emphasis on justice, consultation, shura, and public welfare, maslaha.
Let's define those, because they're really crucial to understanding the non-Western argument. What makes these principles so resilient?
Okay, so adla, or justice, is the foundation. It means fairness and equity in rule. Shura is the principle of consultation, which demands that rulers seek advice from the governed. It's not a multi-party parliament, but it creates a requirement for accountability.
Right.
And maslaha, or public welfare, imposes this requirement that government must act in the best interest of the community. These are demanding, robust political principles. For many scholars, these frameworks offer a viable system that isn't failing or heading toward Western democracy. It's just a different final form.
So the first wave of criticism basically argued that Fukuyama made the mistake of thinking cultural and religious identity would just be absorbed by secular liberalism. And 9/11 and the stability of these other models proved that ideology wasn't the only motor of history.
Right. And if that first challenge was cultural, the second, more recent and profoundly geopolitical wave of criticism targets the core economic and political assumptions of the thesis.
We're talking about the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia. Their success under non-democratic regimes is a direct attack on the premise that liberal democracy is the only path to modern prosperity and stability. If you can have a hyper-successful market economy Without political freedom, the whole engine of the end of history thesis just sputters.
That's precisely it. China maintains a one-party Leninist state while dominating global markets. Russia, well, it has the veneer of democracy, is what political scientists call an autocracy or an anocracy.
Let's clarify anocracy for you listening. What does that actually mean for the Russian system?
An anocracy is a kind of hybrid regime. It's not a full-on autocracy with brute force, but it's definitely not a functioning democracy either. It's a system where you have formal democratic institutions like elections and a legislature, but the rules are systematically manipulated, the opposition is suppressed, and power is highly centralized to keep the incumbent in charge.
And that hybrid system, plus immense military and resource power, creates a powerful and challenging rival to the pure liberal democratic model.
And this threat was recognized pretty early by scholars like Azargat and Robert Kagan as the real challenge to Fukuyama's prediction.
What did they argue?
Well, Azargat, writing in the mid-2000s, was very explicit. He argued that the success of these two authoritarian great powers could genuinely end the end of history. He kind of dismissed the threat of political Islam because while it's ideological, it doesn't offer a viable modern alternative for a developed country.
Or a serious military threat.
Right. But China and Russia offer scalable, powerful, and economically successful rival models that can inspire and support other authoritarian states.
And Robert Kagan echoed that in 2008 with his book, The Return of History and the End of Dreams, basically positioning it as the official rejection of that post-Cold War consensus. History, meaning great power competition, is simply back.
And this forced Fukuyama to keep updating and defending his thesis. By 2008, he had to deal with the clear strength of Putin's regime and China's economic miracle, and his initial counter-argument focused not on the reality, but on the enduring power of the democratic ideal.
What was the essence of that defense?
He argued that despite all the authoritarian gains, the democratic ideal is still the strongest and most broadly appealing idea out there. And his evidence for this: that even powerful autocrats, he named Putin, Chavez, Hu Jintao, felt they had to conform to the outward rituals of democracy.
That's a clever defense.
Yeah.
The ideal is so strong you have to pretend to follow it. How does that actually play out?
It means they still hold elections even if they're completely fixed. They still talk about the will of the people and constitutional rule even as they're gutting those things. To Fukuyama, this proved that liberal democracy still had cognitive dominance as the only legitimate form of government.
So the ultimate theoretical winner is still liberal democracy, even if dictators are corrupting it. But the geopolitical reality changed profoundly with the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, pushing Fukuyama to admit there was a genuine ultimate nightmare scenario that could invalidate his life's work.
Yes. By March 2022, the stakes had completely changed. He described his ultimate fear, a world where China provides full material support to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and in return, Russia supports a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
And if that hypothetical alliance were to succeed, what would that mean for the end of history?
He was unequivocal. He said that if the United States and the rest of the West could not stop that coordinated, successful challenge, and these non-democratic great powers came to dominate the new global system, then that really is the end of history.
Wow.
It would prove that authoritarian models are not only sustainable but superior at projecting power, thereby offering a viable ideological alternative and restarting the very struggle he declared was over.
So the geopolitical challenge is truly existential. If history returns, it returns with nuclear weapons and integrated supply chains, making it far more dangerous than the philosophical debates of the 1990s.
And we've looked at the external threats, culture, geopolitics. But maybe the most insidious threat is the one Fukuyama himself came to recognize as he watched the West struggle: political decay, corruption, and the internal shortcomings of liberal democracy itself.
This marks a really fundamental pivot for Fukuyama, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He went from defending the ideal of liberal democracy to critically assessing the quality of existing ones. Because even if the ideal is theoretically superior, if the current democracies are failing, the victory's kind of hollow.
Exactly. In 2014, he published a major update, admitting he was far less idealistic than he'd been 25 years before. And this pessimism came from two big factors: clear democratic backsliding globally, in places like Thailand, Turkey, Nicaragua, and the widespread failure of post-dictatorship movements.
He's talking about the Arab Spring movements, the color revolutions in places like Ukraine, where the initial push for democracy just failed to create stable, lasting systems.
Precisely. They won the revolution, but they failed to build the resilient institutions. And Fukuyama identified the core problem as not some foreign ideology, but simply the failure of elected governments to provide the substance that citizens actually want.
What specifically is that substance? It sounds so basic, but it's clearly the bedrock of legitimacy.
It's the absolute bedrock. The substance includes personal security, shared economic growth, so benefits are spread out, not just hoarded by a few, and basic public services, clean water, education, healthcare.
Things that allow people to thrive.
Right. And Fukuyama initially thought that economic growth and strong democratic institutions would just reinforce each other. But the evidence showed that in many places, that escalator to prosperity it stalled. The system might be superior in theory, but the execution was failing.
And he didn't just limit this to fragile emerging democracies. He warned this political rot was infecting the established powers, including the United States.
He pointed to the symptoms that undermine a democracy from within: corruption, crony capitalism, and, crucially, the rise of populism fueled by inequality in the post-fact world. After Brexit and the 2016 U.S. election, he said he hadn't really formulated a theory 25 years ago about how established democracies could backslide, but they clearly can. He grew genuinely fearful, saying that America's political rot was infecting the world order.
So even if the philosophical idea of democracy wins, the internal structural failure to deliver could render the victory moot. And this leads perfectly into the structural critique from the philosopher Slavoj Žižek.
Žižek's critique is fundamental because it goes right for the economic assumption at the heart of Fukuyama's model. Fukuyama assumed this permanent required link between liberal democracy and market capitalism.
If you modernize your economy, you must eventually democratize your politics.
Right. But Žižek argues that the massive success of nations like China and Singapore has fundamentally broken this required link.
You no longer need political freedom to get booming economic growth. What does breaking that link mean for the thesis?
It means the primary engine driving countries toward liberalism is just gone. If authoritarian state capitalism can be just as or even more effective at generating wealth, then the incentive for non-democratic nations to follow the Western path just vanishes.
And furthermore, Žižek argues that the success of free market capitalism itself actually creates the problems that destabilize liberal democracy.
Yes. He says the problems generated by unfettered capital widening wealth inequality, job insecurity, environmental damage are the very things fueling mass popular unrest globally. In his view, the system is struggling to survive the challenges created by the economic engine it depends on. It's like a self-destruct mechanism.
Finally, we turn to the most fierce and perhaps the most morally challenging critique: Jacques Derrida's condemnation in his 1993 work, Spectres of Marx. Derrida isn't interested in geopolitics or economics. He delivers a fundamental moral indictment of the whole celebration.
Derrida was scathing. He basically dismissed Fukuyama's work as a symptom of Western cultural anxiety, a loud, premature victory lap to reassure itself that Marxism was really, truly dead.
He saw it as rhetoric, not analysis.
Exactly. But the core of his critique forces you, the listener, to confront the human cost of this supposed Western triumph. He doesn't care about ideology. He cares about arithmetic.
That's it. Derrida highlights this powerful, macroscopic fact that the 90s euphoria just overlooked. He forces us to consider the total human cost, writing, "Never have violence, inequality, exclusion, famine, and thus economic oppression affected as many human beings in the history of the earth and of humanity."
It's a staggering statement.
It demands a moral reckoning. He's arguing that under the global dominance of Western liberalism and its capitalist model, the absolute number of people suffering reached historical highs.
He concluded that celebrating the end of history, when so many people were still subjugated, starved, or exterminated, was just perverse. He argued that this end of history was less a political theory and more a kind of Christian eschatology, a desire for a final utopian conclusion, a holy alliance, rather than an honest assessment of the complex, often terrible reality of the global system.
Derrida's point is devastatingly simple. If the system truly won, why are the winners so few and the victims so many? It challenges the fundamental moral superiority claimed by liberal democracy. So what does this all mean? When we synthesize this deep dive, the sources show us that Fukuyama's thesis was incredibly powerful, and it was rooted in genuine empirical post-Cold War trends, the decrease in war, the collapse of rivals. But that power immediately provokes these robust, evolving counterattacks.
The end of history thesis just failed to adequately account for three major forces: First, the cultural and civilizational depth of non-Western identities.
Proving that religious and ethnic loyalties were not subservient to secular liberalism.
Second, the geopolitical and economic viability of successful authoritarian great powers, proving that the link between capitalism and democracy can be broken.
And third, and maybe most pressingly today, the structural and internal failure of established democracies to deliver the substance, security, growth, and justice that maintains their legitimacy.
The debate about the future of governance is far from settled. The biggest threat today isn't some new ideology trying to conquer the West, but the internal corrosion and failure to live up to the promise of liberal democracy, validating Fukuyama's later, more pragmatic concerns.
And this leads us to the final provocative thought. The one challenge Fukuyama himself identified as the single thing that could truly alter the political end state he described.
He stated clearly that there can be no end of history without an end of modern natural science and technology.
The implications of that phrase are just massive. If history, the ideological struggle, has ended, it's ended for humanity as we currently understand it. But if technology allows us to fundamentally redefine human nature, giving us increasing control over our own evolution, the post-human future, or the political system designed for our current version of humanity based on rights, dignity, and recognition, remain viable.
Or will we be forced into a new, terrifying, unforeseen epoch of political organization that makes Fukuyama's current thesis completely irrelevant?
That is the ultimate question for you to mull over as you contemplate the true meaning of history's ending.
You know that feeling. You are running late, keys in hand, rushing to catch the train. You reach for that last perfect slice of toast, and what happens?
Oh, you know what happens.
It slips, of course. It doesn't just fall, it flips in the air, performing this sickening slow-motion arc, and always lands butter side down.
A tiny, tragic disaster right on your kitchen floor.
Exactly.
Or maybe, you finally pick the shortest line at the grocery store, you've done the math, and then the person in front of you, well, they decide this is the perfect moment to try and pay with a coupon from 1987.
Yes. In that moment of just, utter frustration, we all say the same thing. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. We call it Murphy's Law.
It's our cultural shorthand for cosmic resignation. It's like the ultimate verbal shrug.
But here at the Deep Dive, we don't really accept cliches at face value. Our mission today is to strip back this popular version of Murphy's Law and find out where it really came from.
Right. We want to know why a simple observation about, frankly, human error became this global proclamation of doom.
We've got some fascinating source material that details its really disputed birth. A chaotic scene involving high-speed military rocket sleds and, well, some pretty reckless scientists in the late 1940s.
And we're going to investigate whether Edward A. Murphy Jr. was, as some sources claim, kind of an arrogant guy blaming his staff, or if he was a meticulous engineer offering a crucial design principle that actually saved lives.
And I think this is the most important part. We're going to look at the powerful academic arguments that claim the law isn't a fundamental truth of the universe at all. Instead, it might just be the most pervasive example of confirmation bias in human history.
It's a journey from engineering failure to cognitive science. It's fascinating.
So before we jump into the history, let's get our terms right. Because Murphy's Law is the most famous, but it's not the only one.
Not at all. It's part of a whole family of what you might call universal perversity laws.
It's defined as an adage or an epigram. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. But it gets confused with its cousins, right?
Absolutely. Especially in the UK, they often use Sod's Law. It's functionally identical to how most people use Murphy's Law. If you drop your keys, they will absolutely fall down the nearest drain.
It's just pure bad luck.
Pure bad luck. But then you have Finagle's Law, which has a bit more of a twist.
Okay.
Finagle's Law adds malice and, crucially, timing. It states anything that can go wrong will, at the worst possible moment.
Ah, so it's personalized.
It's personalized spite. If you're a scientist and you need perfect silence for an experiment, Finagle's Law guarantees that's when the construction crew starts jackhammering outside your window.
Right. And we should also give a quick mention to Mupfre's Law, that's with an H.
Yes, M-U-P-H-R-Y.
Yeah.
This one's a bit of an inside joke for writers and editors. It states that if you write anything criticizing editing or proofreading, there will be a fault in what you have written.
I feel like I've seen that happen a million times online.
It's almost a mathematical certainty.
Yeah.
But what's crucial for our deep dive is that the original statement from Edward A. Murphy Jr. was, well, it was far more specific and less fatalistic than the popular version we all know.
Okay, so let's get into that. Let's trace how a precise engineering warning morphed into a global catchphrase for doom. Before we get to the rocket sleds and the high G forces of the 1940s, we have to acknowledge something. The concept that the universe is inherently tricky, that your toaster might secretly hate you, that's centuries old. This wasn't some new idea from an Air Force captain.
No, not at all. That recognition that disorder is sort of the natural state of things is an ancient philosophical thread. But we can actually pinpoint some specific precursors that show just how common this idea was long before Murphy.
Okay, so where do we start?
Let's start in the mid-19th century. A British mathematician, Augustus de Morgan, writing in 1866. He laid out a version of this idea in pure probability.
Probability, not spite.
Exactly, he said. Whatever can happen will happen if we make trials enough.
So it's just a numbers game?
It's just a numbers game.
Yeah.
There's no malice. If there's a 1 in a million chance of catastrophic failure, De Morgan is just saying, if you run the system 1,000,001 times, you're going to hit it.
Right.
Eventually.
And there's some speculation, right, that Murphy might just be a misremembering of De Morgan.
There is, and it's a compelling theory. The brain loves a catchy name. But if we move forward a decade, we find a version that's much closer to the real, functional Murphy's Law.
And that would be Alfred Holt in 1877, a marine engineer.
Yes, and he was talking about the dangers of sea travel. He observed that anything that can go wrong at sea generally does go wrong sooner or later.
But he wasn't just stating the problem, he was offering a solution.
That's the key. Holt was all about design safety. He said, because of this, sufficient stress can hardly be laid on the advantages of simplicity.
Simplify the system, because you can't eliminate human error fatigue, distraction, so you have to design machines that are resistant to it.
It's a foundational principle of what we now call defensive design.
But if we want to get back to that idea of universal spite, we should probably jump to 1908.
Ah, yes. The perspective of the British stage magician Neville Maskelyne. His whole job was about high-stakes performance, where one tiny error ruins everything.
He was dealing with props and gadgets under pressure. He said that on special occasions, everything that can go wrong will go wrong.
And I love his explanation. He chalked it up to the malignity of matter or to the total depravity of inanimate things.
The total depravity of inanimate things. That's perfect. That's my car every winter morning.
It perfectly captures that belief that objects are actively working against us. It's not entropy. It's that the car decided to ruin your day.
And speaking of that, we have to talk about the philosophical joke that just nailed this idea right before Murphy got his name on it. Resistentialism.
Oh, this is one of my favorite detours.
Yeah.
Coined by the humorist Paul Jennings in 1948. It's a play on resistance and existentialism.
And it describes the seemingly spiteful behavior manifested by inanimate objects.
It's why the one wobbly wheel on the shopping cart always skeers you into the pyramid of soup cans. The cart is actively resisting your will.
Or how the cables behind your TV somehow braid themselves into a knot when you weren't looking.
Inanimate spite in action. And for any of our listeners who are into astronomy, there's Spode's Law.
Bitches.
The skies are always cloudy at the exact moment you finally get your telescope set up for that rare celestial event.
Of course they are.
So the intellectual landscape was just saturated with this idea.
Yeah.
But for it to become a global phenomenon, the concept needed a name. And it needed a dramatic origin story.
Right. It needed a moment of verifiable, high-stakes failure. A moment where the stakes were literally life and death. Okay, let's set the scene for this origin story. It's 1948, 1949. We're deep in the Californian desert at Muroc Army Airfield. We know it today as Edwards Air Force Base.
This is the dawn of the Cold War. The military is pushing the absolute limits of human endurance.
And our two main characters arrive on the scene. First, Edward A. Murphy Jr., a U.S. Air Force captain and an aeronautical engineer.
And second, the man leading the project, an incredibly driven flight surgeon named Colonel John Stapp. The project was designated MX-981.
So what exactly was MX-981? It sounds very top secret.
It was incredibly dangerous work. They were testing human tolerance for G-forces during rapid deceleration. Basically, how violent of a crash can a human body survive?
And to do this, they used a giant rocket sled on a railroad track.
A sled that could go over 600 miles per hour and then stop, well, almost instantly. And Colonel Stapp was famous for being his own test subject.
He would ride the sled himself.
He would. Talk about putting your body on the line for science.
So where does Murphy fit into this?
Murphy was the instrumentation guy. He was brought in to install these highly sensitive electronic strain gauges onto the harness clamps that held the test subject.
His job was to get the data, to precisely measure the G-forces.
Correct. But during a critical trial run, maybe with a chimp, maybe a dummy, the whole thing goes sideways. A simple avoidable error.
What happened?
The sensors gave a reading of 0. No data at all. Turns out Murphy's assistant had wired them backwards. There were 2 ways to connect them. One right, one wrong. And he picked the wrong one.
Oh, the frustration that moment must have been immense.
Unbelievable. All that risk and preparation wasted. And this is where the story splits. This is where we get 2 completely different accounts of what Murphy said and what he meant.
Okay, let's hear account number 1.
This comes from George E. Nichols, an engineer who was there. Nichols said that a furious Murphy immediately blamed his assistant, snarling, "If that guy has any way of making a mistake, he will."
Ouch. That's not great leadership. He's passing the buck.
And according to Nichols, the rest of the team thought it was arrogant. So they started calling this principle Murphy's Law as a joke, in mockery of him.
So in that version, the law is basically a sarcastic workplace jab.
Exactly. But there's another side to the story.
Account number 2.
This one comes from Murphy's own son, Robert Murphy. And he completely denies the mockery narrative. He says his father was a stickler for safety, and his statement wasn't a jab at one guy. It was a core engineering philosophy.
So what did he claim his father actually said?
Good quote in this version is, "If there's more than one way to do a job, and one of those ways will result in disaster, then he will do it that way."
That is profoundly different.
It's night and day.
That's not about blaming a person. It's about blaming the design.
Precisely. It's an instruction. The failure wasn't just the guy wired it wrong. The failure was, I designed a system where it was possible to wire it wrong.
So it's about making systems foolproof, defensive design.
And this proactive, positive interpretation is the one that got popularized, thanks to Colonel Stapp.
The guy riding the sled.
Guy riding the sled. The press kept asking him how his team avoided any serious injuries, given the incredible risks.
And his answer is the key.
He told them they were successful because they always took Murphy's Law into consideration.
So he spun it. He turned a story about failure into a mantra for success.
A complete PR masterstroke. For Stapp, the law wasn't about fate. It was about preparedness, redundancy, and anticipating the worst so you could prevent it.
But just when that story seems all tied up, the timeline gets complicated.
Right. This is where the deep dive gets even murkier. We can't actually find the phrase Murphy's Law in any public documents before 1951, a couple years after the supposed incident.
And there's evidence that the phrase was already in use before the rocket sled incident.
Strong evidence. A researcher found a 1952 book where a physicist, later identified as Howard Percy Bob Robertson, was quoted calling something Murphy's Law or the fourth law of thermodynamics.
Okay, and the key part is, when was he interviewed?
He was interviewed in early 1949. Before the Muroc incident happened or was publicized, he said, if anything can go wrong, it will.
So the name was already floating around the aerospace and physics community.
It seems so. The rocket sled incident was probably just the most dramatic story that attached itself to the name and launched it into public consciousness.
And the final word on this chaotic origin?
The Ig Nobel Prize. In 2003, Stapp, Murphy, and Nichols, the 3 men with competing stories, were jointly awarded the prize in engineering.
For what?
For probably giving birth to the name.
That's perfect. The true history of Murphy's Law is itself an example of Murphy's Law. Okay, so we've waded through the history. Now let's pivot to how scientists and mathematicians see the law today. Because while it's fun to blame Edward Murphy for our bad luck,
the academic consensus usually points the finger right back at our own brains.
Right. Many serious thinkers just dismiss the popular version of the law as, well, nonsense.
Complete nonsense. For the law to be true in that popular sense, inanimate objects would need to have intention. They'd need memory and the capacity for spite.
Which they don't.
Which they don't. And Richard Dawkins is probably the most famous voice making this argument. He says Murphy's Law is purely a function of confirmation bias.
Okay, so how does he explain it?
He uses this great example of a film crew being interrupted by airplanes flying overhead. Planes are flying over all the time. Most of the day, you don't even notice them.
Yeah.
But when do you notice them?
When you're trying to record clean audio.
Exactly. The one time the plane flies over right as the actor is delivering their big line, you throw your hands up and yell, Murphy's Law. The planes always know.
But they don't. We just ignore the hundreds of times they fly over silently. We only remember the one time it confirmed our belief that things go wrong.
That is the textbook definition of confirmation bias. We seek out and remember the evidence that fits our narrative, and we discard everything that doesn't. Our psychology is flawed, not the physics of the universe.
And this is backed up by statistics, right? David Hand and the law of truly large numbers.
Yes, this is the mathematical muscle behind the argument. The law of truly large numbers basically says that with a big enough sample size, even incredibly unlikely events have to happen eventually.
So, my toast landing butter side down.
It's not a curse, it's just that you've made thousands of slices of toast in your life. The law of averages says you are guaranteed to drop it, and it's guaranteed to land butter side down sometimes.
And those are the times I remember. I don't remember the 10,000 times it didn't fall.
Precisely. We assign this cosmic significance to events that were statistically always going to happen. It's not malice, it's just math.
But what about that other thread, the one Robertson mentioned back in 1949, the connection to thermodynamics?
Right, the idea that Murphy's law is just a folksy version of the second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy.
The law that says disorder or chaos always increases in a closed system.
And philosophically, that makes a lot of sense. Your desk gets messy, your car breaks down. The universe tends toward chaos. It feels right.
But it's not actually a good scientific analogy.
Not really. And one researcher, Atanu Chatterjee, actually found that you could mathematically disprove Murphy's law by using another fundamental concept in physics.
Which is?
The principle of least action.
Okay, that sounds important. We need to define that.
In short, it's a deep principle that says physical systems, when moving from one state to another, will always choose the most efficient path.
The path of least resistance.
Essentially, yes, the path that minimizes energy or time. Light bends when it enters water because that's the fastest path, not the most chaotic one.
So there's a direct conflict. Murphy's law predicts maximum chaos.
And the principle of least action predicts maximum efficiency. The universe, at a fundamental level, seems to prefer efficiency and stability, not spiteful chaos.
So the academic consensus is that the popular version of Murphy's law is really just a trick of our own minds. It's defeated by logic, probability, and maybe even physics.
And yet it persists.
Yeah.
Because we are human, and we are wired to find patterns in misfortune.
So once an idea like this gets into the public imagination, it branches out. People start creating their own versions.
Oh, absolutely. The core concept that you have to plan for the unexpected is so useful that it led to countless variations, many compiled by the writer Arthur Bloch.
But the most immediate reaction to all that pessimism had to be, well, optimism.
Of course. Which gives us the wonderfully named Ypram's Law.
Ypram's Law.
Y-H-P-R-U-M. It's Murphy, spelled backwards.
I love that. So what does it say?
It's the simple optimistic reversal. Anything that can go right will go right. It's the philosophical inversion.
But the core idea also moved into more practical fields, right? Like management.
Definitely. You see it in Peter Drucker's formulation, often called Drucker's Law. If one thing goes wrong, everything else will, and at the same time.
That feels very true for anyone who's worked in a complex organization. A single glitch doesn't stay isolated.
It cascades. One small error in the supply chain suddenly brings the entire system to a halt. It's about the fragility of complex systems.
And then on a more domestic level, we have my personal favorite, Mrs. Murphy's Law.
A classic. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong while Mr. Murphy is out of town.
The plumbing only explodes when the one person who knows how to fix it is on vacation 3,000 miles away.
It's a universal truth. But the most profound modern attempt to sort of rehabilitate the law comes from the 2014 film Interstellar.
Right. They offer a completely different interpretation. They strip out all the pessimism.
The character in the film says Murphy's Law doesn't mean that something bad will happen. It means that whatever can happen will happen.
That's a huge philosophical shift.
It's monumental. It's no longer a prediction of disaster. It's a declaration of probability. It means both disaster and triumph are on the table. Both are guaranteed to happen if the conditions allow for it.
And that ties perfectly back to Colonel John Stapp.
It does. Back to the rocket sled. He didn't use the law to complain about fate. He used it to ensure survival.
He understood that all possible outcomes, good and bad, had to be accounted for.
That is the very essence of defensive design and risk management. The interstellar version takes away the malice and leaves us with a powerful tool for planning.
So in its highest form, Murphy's Law isn't a curse at all. It's an intellectual command.
Exactly. It tells us to stop focusing on the mistake and start focusing on the design flaw that made the mistake possible in the first place. So we've taken this ultimate cliche of human frustration, the spilled coffee, the traffic jam, and we've put it under the microscope. And the true story is, I think, much more instructive than the catchphrase.
Let's quickly run through the key takeaways from this deep dive. First, the original intent, whether it was Murphy or someone else, was a cautionary design principle.
Right. If there's a way to do it that results in catastrophe, someone will do it that way. It was a command to engineers to eliminate the catastrophic options.
Second, the popular version that we all use, the one about cosmic spite, is almost entirely fueled by our own cognitive biases.
It's confirmation bias. It's the law of truly large numbers. It's our psychology, not physics, that makes us remember the bad and forget the good.
And finally, the core debate is about what the law is truly about. Is it human error? Is it engineering planning? Or is it the universe being actively malicious?
And the history suggests it started as a technical warning, got promoted as a planning tool, and was finally popularized as a sort of psychological crutch for when things inevitably go wrong.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to consider. We talked about that interstellar interpretation, which views the law not as fate, but as a full accounting of all possibilities.
So if you accept that whatever can happen will happen, how does that really change the way you plan things in your own life?
Does knowing that probability is inevitable make you more inclined to just plan defensively for the worst-case scenario, to assume the toast will always land butter side down?
Or does the flip side, Yepram's law, compel you to also actively seek out and design for the improbable best-case scenario?
If the universe doesn't have malice, only possibility, then maybe Murphy's Law isn't a tool for pessimism at all.
Maybe it's the ultimate guide to comprehensive optimism, forcing us to build things that can anticipate and overcome every single vulnerability. We'll leave that little engineering challenge for you to decide.